To all the Rosies and Homefront Joes, and welcome back to On the Victory Homefront, where we explore the history, traditions, and everyday wisdom that helped families thrive during some of the most challenging times in our nation's history. Today's episode is going to be a little more personal. One of the goals I've had with this podcast is not only to learn about life on the World War II homefront and to share that, but in small ways to bring some of that mindset into my everyday life. And lately, I've started noticing something interesting happening right in our own kitchen. Since moving to our new property, the meals that end up on our table have changed. And it wasn't gradual, it actually happened pretty quickly. Now, I talked about this in an earlier podcast when I first moved to our new location, because part of that change simply comes from being and living in a different place. When we lived in a more urban setting, certain foods were always easy to get. The grocery stores were close, options were everywhere, and if you wanted a particular ingredient, it wasn't very hard to find. And our diets at that time reflected that. But after moving out here, I've noticed that some of those foods just aren't as readily available anymore. Some things require a longer trip into town, some things we simply just don't buy as often, and some foods that used to be convenient just aren't part of our routine anymore. Now, of course, we're not living under rationing, but it did remind me of something families experienced during the World War II years. Items that people had once been able to buy freely suddenly had become limited. It was harder to find or required even more planning than it used to. And when that happens, kitchens adapt, meals change, and cooks begin leaning on ingredients that are dependable, practical, and easy to work with. And that's exactly what I've noticed happening here. Our meals have started shifting toward simpler dishes, the kinds of meals that would have looked very familiar in an earlier American kitchen. Stews simmering on the stove, casseroles baked in the oven, plates of meat and potatoes that are filling and comforting at the end of the day. And these are not elaborate meals. I've shown some pictures on my Facebook page of some of the meals that we've been having, and they are not the kind of dishes that you would expect from a 4-star restaurant. They're the kind of meals you might expect to see coming out of a farmhouse kitchen. And interestingly enough, these are the same kinds of meals many families on the wartime home front were cooking every day. So when you start living closer to the land, a life off of the land, cooking begins to follow a different rhythm. Meals become less about trying something trendy or complicated, and they're more about what makes sense and what ingredients you have and what foods keep well in your environment, such as I can. So having a basement that is the cooler temperatures that enables me to preserve my food a little better. And during World War II, canning was important, but not just that. Not as many homes as now had refrigerators. So they had to really pay attention to what foods kept well and in what meals can feed a family after a long day of work. Because war work was something that was very common in every household. A lot of women were going to work. During the winter months, leaning into that style of cooking has actually been very natural for me. When it's cold outside, those richer and heartier dishes like beef stew just feel right. And I just made a stew last week, and that is actually what influenced this week's podcast. So a pot of stew slowly simmering through the afternoon, casserole warming the kitchen in the evening, something simple and satisfying waiting at the end of the day. And that's something that I have been finding myself leaning towards. And what's been easier is I said that it's been easier in the winter because a lot of these meals I would make periodically before, but now they're showing up in our diet daily. So it was no stranger for me to make pot roast here and there. It was no stranger for me to make, a beef stew, a chicken pot pie. Those were very common dishes that I would make throughout the wintertime for years. But I would also mix it in with a lot more dishes that we see today. And moving to our new property, that's just not so much in our cards because this area is different. It is a more rural area. I do live by towns. They're so much smaller than the town that we just moved from. And though they do have more trendy places to eat, it is just something that we are not finding ourselves doing. We are leaning more towards what we can do here at our own home. Now, I am a little concerned because living this lifestyle, as we start getting closer to summer, this is where I think our kitchen and myself might face a bit of a challenge. Summer cooking has always been a little different. In our modern world, we're used to having an incredible variety of foods available to us, and not just different ingredients, but different cuisines: Italian, Mexican, Asian, Mediterranean. We've become used to having endless options when it comes to planning meals. But when you start thinking about what a very typical summer table might have looked like on the wartime home front, the picture actually might be surprisingly simple for many to see. If the garden was producing, you might see fresh vegetables served exactly as they were picked. Sometimes that meant something as straightforward as sliced tomatoes on a plate. Just tomatoes, maybe with a little salt, and that was a side dish. And to be honest, most modern families don't really eat that way anymore. We have never eaten that way. And the last person I personally remember who would happily sit down with a plate of sliced tomatoes was my dad. He was born during the wartime years, and that's the way his family ate when he grew up, and it reflected that earlier generation. The fresh vegetables from the garden were often served very simply, and that is something that we have started to do here on the home front. And I'm going to be honest, part of me struggles with that because to me it feels too simple. We grow up now, or we live in a time where everything is getting elevated. What's the next best thing? And so when I make a pot of green beans, I feel like if I'm not doing something additional to just making a pot of green beans, I am not putting in enough effort. I'm not elevating the plate. And that is something, when you want to live more simply, when you want to live off the land, you have to try to get that voice out of your head saying, oh, it can't just be green beans. It's got to be green beans with this and this and that. And you're going to bake it, then do this, then it's going to be rolled up in some type of pastry. And you have to get away from that thinking. It's okay to have just a pot of green beans as a side dish. Now, I grew up that way as a young girl. That was something very normal that I would eat going over to my grandmother's house. But my grandmother was part of that greatest generation. So to them, that it wasn't a second thought. There's food on the table. You're going to have a pot of carrots, and maybe they'll be a little buttered. Maybe they won't. You're going to have a plate of tomatoes with a little bit of salt. That is a side dish. And so that is something that I've been not only working on accepting in my head that is okay, but it's just something that I have seen our family evolving towards. And even though I'm struggling a little bit with that simplicity in my head, my family is not. They are very grateful for the meals that I serve, and I'm still planning them. Even if it's just a side of green beans, I'm still planning my meal. I'm still thinking ahead. What do I have? What ingredients do I have that I can create a full meal tonight? And so usually a lot of my ingredients will go into the main portion of the meal, and the side items are just heated up green beans. And today, if you visited someone's home for dinner, you probably wouldn't expect to see a plate of sliced tomatoes just sitting on the table as a side dish. Or maybe you wouldn't expect just to see, a side of green beans. I think our expectations around food have really changed. And that's where I think this summer, not so much this winter, but this summer might be a bit of an interesting learning experience, not just for the family, but really for myself. Because as we continue trying to bring a little bit more of that home front mindset and lifestyle into our everyday life, I'm very curious to see how our meals will evolve as the warmer months arrive. Because living closer to the land doesn't just change what we cook in the winter, it begins to shape what ends up on the table all year long. And the more I explore this way of living, the more I realize that the kitchens of the 1940s weren't really about nostalgia. They were about practicality, using what you had, cooking meals that made sense, not just for the season, but for what you have in your pantry, what's available to you in your area. And in many ways, bringing a little bit of that mindset back into our daily lives feels like reconnecting with the spirit of the home front. And I think it's just a beautiful thing. So that's all I have this week for this week's episode of On the Victory Homefront. It was really just to show you all ways that I am currently bringing in the 1940s into my everyday life. And even though it may not be my family's goal, that's what they're getting. So I hope that this episode inspires you. I hope it helps you just kind of look at how lifestyle, even in our food, has changed from then until now. And to know that simplicity is just as nutritious as that high-level 4-star restaurant. Granted, it is nice to have somebody else cook a meal for you, but it is also incredibly fulfilling to make the meal yourself for your loved ones. So I hope you will join me again for next week's episode. And until then, my friends, remember, victory is in the everyday.